Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. You're most welcome to this episode of Sharia Intelligence, where we will be carrying on our discussion on the Maqasid Sharia and particularly looking at how it's applied. We'll be looking at what in Usul we described as the safety net principles of Maslaha, Saddu Zaria, Istihsan, these istidlal, reason-based tools that scholars use to protect the maqasid of Sharia, and we will start looking at how these tools are used when contexts have changed and situations have moved from the normal tahsiniyat level of comfort to situations of greater difficulty. We will start looking at the various principles that guide decisions of scholars here. I am your host, Muhammad Nuruddin Lemu, and with me to discuss today's topics are two of our distinguished facilitators, trainers of the Sharia Intelligence course, Sister Salatu Sule and Brother Ibrahim Bello. You are most welcome to this program.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'd like to start with asking Sister Salah, or starting with Sister Salah. We have a maxim that scholars have accepted, and they would put it, there is no denying that there would be a change in rulings with changing context. Change in rulings, whether it's ahkam or fatawa, with a change in people's condition, people's priorities, people's situation with time and context. With this in mind, what are the main instruments in Sharia that scholars consider that help them in responding to changing contexts?
Well, when the scholars are looking at how best to come up with rulings that match the context, when the context has changed, they would look at those changes that have to do with the area, the geography, what is it, where is this thing occurring? They would look at things to do with the condition of the people, the status of the people, living standard, if you will, because there are decisions that are made if people are in Darura that would be different from if they're in Hajjah, that is if they're in situations of dire necessity, or is just great difficulty, or is just mere inconvenience. So there would also be that attention on the part of scholars to the living situation of people. They would also consider the hukum, those conditions that come with certain responsibilities. So when it said, for instance, a person should pray because they've reached a certain age, we know there are also exceptions. There are also conditions attached. There are also things that should precede the fulfillment of such obligations. So the scholars would look at some of these factors and consider, based on the place, based on the living condition of the people, based even on custom, where ruling fits one custom but not another place because of the custom or the culture there. They would also look at what are those things that should be treated as priorities, what should therefore come first. These are some of the things the scholars would look at, because laws are made to fit certain context. These rulings that we keep talking about, as we mentioned in the previous episode, the maqasid are fixed, but the rulings themselves are malleable, so they are meant to help people realize the higher objectives of Sharia, and to do so they have to match the context. The main idea at the end of the day is the scholars are looking to see, are there concessions that should be made, and these concessions will be made depending on what is going on at the time. Are there people that will be impacted upon one way or the other, and they would then consider some of these issues as well. So a change in context could mean one of many things. So it's those many things that the scholars pay attention to.
Alam Ibrahim, what would you add to this?
Yeah, as it is said that لا ينكر تغيير الأحكام بتغيير الأزمان، أو لا ينكر تغيير الفتوى بتغيير الزمان والمكان. That rulings are actually based on conditions, and that these rulings if they are tied to these conditions, of which mostly they are often tied to, then as the conditions change, the rulings will change. This is seen practically as the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahabas did. Somebody came to ask the Prophet ﷺ a fatwa regarding what is the ruling of kissing a woman during Ramadan, or his wife really. The Prophet said, no problem. Another person asked for a similar question, and the Prophet ﷺ said, you should not do it. And scholars discern that these were contextual. One person was an elderly man who doesn't have that passion and strong feeling, okay, while the other one was a young man. Similarly, sometimes Umar bin Khattab suspended the hudud, a punishment for theft, this capital punishment for theft, because of a situational change. There was drought, there was famine, there was hardship, there was poverty.
Yeah, he prescribed had punishment.
Exactly, so he suspended it. Not that it is permissible now for people to steal, but he was trying to be realistic. You have also instances where Umar prescribed zakat on horses now, which the Prophet did not. And he gave reason why. The context then was that horses were mere rides. Now horses have become treasure. You have instances also where a man reported his 3 servants who stole a camel and sacrificed the it. Umar was about punishing them, and they laid a complaint but he starved them, and Umar changed the punishment. So you can see, so context dictates change in fatwa, situational changes call for these kind of changes. And you have a number of other issues like this, where if a context change, the fatwa change. Usually context, you are talking of who, maybe where, and maybe when. So sometimes these are terms and conditions, as they say, apply. And nearly each act of ibadah in Islam have terms and conditions attached, either in form of you must fulfill this before this, or this must be a barrier to this, or in the presence of this becomes this.
It reminds me of a case where Abdullah bin Abbas was with some of the companions. I think this was after the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and somebody came and asked him, is murder forgivable? And he answered, no, Allah will not forgive murder. And the man left. And the others said, why would you say Allah will not forgive murder? And he responded to them that he noticed that the man asking the question looked very angry. In other words, the answer being given was, maybe this guy wants to go and kill somebody and is coming for permission. And if it's forgivable, this issue of responding to context, that it's not just the situation has changed, but even who is asking, what's the condition of the person asking the question, as you said, the differing answers the Prophet would give to a man who is asking whether it's okay to kiss your wife while you are fasting. And the Prophet looks at who's asking the question and, what's a more appropriate answer. One of those things that have been alluded to by Sister Salatu when she started, was the declaratory rulings, the ahkam al-wad'iyah. When scholars mention the maxim, la yunkar tagayyur al-ahkam or fatawa bitagayyur al-azman or ahwal or zaman, some say ahkam don't change with contexts. Only fatwas change with contexts. The majority say no. Even though there's a hukum, there are certain ahkam al-wad'iyah, which if those change, then the hukum changes. Could you elaborate further on how the ahkam al-wad'iyah affect hukum when it comes to scholars changing rulings as the context changes?
Yeah, like we said before, ahkam al-wad'iyah, to start with, are declaratory rules. They are concerned with who, when, why, and probably what are the enhancers, what are the inhibitors. In other words, what are the barriers. Nearly, if you take each act of ibadah, it has these kind of conditions like we mentioned earlier. Take Hajj for instance. Before it is mandatory, you must have attained the age of puberty. Else scholars say if you perform Hajj while you are younger, you have to repeat, because then it was not wajib. You must be fit. You must be wealthy enough to go. The road must be safe. Okay? So same thing with Salat. It must be time. You must be free from bleeding, menstrual bleeding. You must have ablution. Your clothing must be clean. You must face Al-Qibla. And a number of these things. And sometimes, like we say, so all of these are conditions, and they are called ahkamul wadi'iyya. Nearly all acts of ibadah, when scholars will give you a general rule, it is assumed under normal circumstance. Like they will say terms and conditions apply. But it's when you go under terms and conditions that you say, okay, now I see. So, now look at it.
So what you're saying is, general rules of Sharia are default settings.
Are default settings.
Assuming everybody is fine,
yes,
tahsiniyat,
exactly.
no problems.
Yes.
But once situation changes and there is a problem,
yeah,
you're saying then the laws change.
Yeah, like we are seeing, look at typical examples of fasting. If you're a traveler, you're permitted to forfeit fasting. Your prayers, you can shorten them, you can combine them. What if a lady menstruates? She's exempted from fasting. What if somebody is very old? It's also exempted from fasting. But not fasting alone, a number of other ibadat. Prayers. Scholars will say among the conditions of prayer for somebody that is fit, you must pray standing, except voluntary prayers that you can say while sitting. What of somebody that is old? What of somebody that is crippled? What of? So all these kind of conditions, you can see that these are acts of ibadah, but they are now changing. Because of what? Conditions. So declaratory rules now come in. So when you are given these rulings under normal circumstance, you assume this is the normative position. But like we say, fasting, if somebody is ill, somebody is weak, or it rains, or you are at home, sometimes scholars give all these conditions. Some rulings are okay for somebody that is at home under normal circumstance. What if you are on journey? It is not binding on you. Okay? So a number of other acts of worship. When we take Hajj, Zakat too has conditions attached. Even in business transactions, you have conditions. You don't sell what you don't own. Okay? You don't benefit from somebody's capital in business. Okay? You don't collect money from somebody and you trade on the same money to make profit. Like there are conditions. So what was halal before becomes haram because of just a shift in equation. So this kind of declaratory rules tells you that no, it is not fixed. It's just each case should be treated in its own context. And that's why context specific is very important in all that we do, in all the rulings of Sharia. Context is another important thing. After going through everything, then you ask, what is its condition? In fact, even the law of inheritance, there are contexts, there are situations, there are those that will block you, there are those that if they are not there, you benefit. Same thing Salat. So this is it.
Sister Salah, what would you add to this discussion?
To add to it, we can also look at things that are as serious as punishments in Sharia law, especially even those ones that are hard, which are said to be fixed in a sense. That when maybe a situation arises in a specific context, there are factors that lead to a certain degree of doubt. The degree of doubt will then affect the severity of the sanction to be imposed, and we've given the example before of Umar radiallahu anhu. There's also the point that we have those aspects of Islamic law that we say are fluid, changeable. Then we have those ones that we've always talked about, ma'lum ad-din bidorura, that they are set, they are those things that are established by qat'i thubut and qat'i dilala evidence that the authenticity is certain and the meaning is clear. So on the surface of it, when you say the meaning of a verse is very clear on something like Hajj or Zakat or Salah and so on and so forth, one would then assume, one could be forgiven for assuming that those things don't change. But when we look at this same concept of what of when the context changes, or as Brother Ibrahim has mentioned, there are conditions that come with even these devotional acts of worship or foundational aspects of the deen. That when the context shifts, then those things, even if they are not done away with, the rules around them are relaxed. Some of the conditions are relaxed. Some of the permissions now granted to such changing contexts are activated. And by activation, I mean some of these conditions or permissions, the rukhsa, the concessions, are already embedded already in the sources of Sharia themselves. So when a jurist is going to take the position that there is this concession, there is that concession, this can be lifted, that can be dropped, the jurist would often still go back to the source to align with the evidence itself. There's evidence to establish such. Usually, you'll find them even among the things that are qat'i dilala and qat'i thubut. So it's always important for that realignment. That rarely would you hear a jurist talking about concession or relaxation without that jurist being able to show that there is a root in the textual evidence themselves. Lastly, it's also important to note that the jurists would and do and need to consistently look at the existing ruling and look at the proposed new ruling and do that thing we keep talking about, triangulate, weigh all these options, the who, the when, the how, and all the other things we discussed before, the benefits, the harm, the degree, and all of that.
When it comes to change of situation resulting in the change of the rulings, as has been discussed in earlier episodes, scholars look at what is the concession that is going to be made, the degree of concession that is going to be made that would be proportionate to the difficulty that is going to be faced. So, as with the case that we brought before, if somebody is starving, pork would be allowed, but not eat until you are, bloated and full. Eat just what is required to keep you going until a halal alternative comes. If somebody has to expose a part of their aura, a part of their private part to a doctor, you expose what is needed and not more than that. Yeah. When then people find themselves in difficulty, the more severe the difficulty, the greater the concessions. The more the kind and the quality of haram that become permissible due to rukhsa, due to the need for concession or the difficulty. For the purpose of relaxing laws, how do scholars classify the harams? How do scholars classify what kind of haram would they start giving concession for before they start conceding on major harams? So what's the criteria for determining what is the first haram you will relax before you consider somebody's situation as more important and you relax even greater harams? When it comes to greater, lesser haram, greater, lesser evil, what would you consider a basic criteria that we should be aware of that scholars use in this classification of prohibitions?
Okay. One basic one is haram of the means and haram of the ends. Haram of the means means those things that are haram, prohibited, not because of the action itself, but because of what the action is likely to lead to. That's haram of the means. So the wasa'il, they are looking, those are the things that come under haram of the means. Haram of the ends are the things that are prohibited because of their own nature. Examples of haram of the ends, that's haram of the purpose itself. It is those, those things that they themselves affect the maqasid. So they touch on them directly, not that they are a means to getting to causing harm to them. So for instance, zina, illegitimate sexual relations, and that is considered haram of the means because it is a direct haram of the end, because it has direct impact on some of those vital maqasid, such as the hifdul ahl, the protection of the family, among other things. Another likely one is intoxication, the consumption of alcohol itself to the extent of one becoming intoxicated. These come under haram of the ends. Now, haram of the means, let's use the same example of illegitimate sexual relations. It would be something like flirting, what many people today call it's normal or it's harmless, flirting over the phone. Oh, send me a picture of yourself, and then you just send the picture and you say, oh, but the lady will say, but I'm wearing hijab, and the gentleman is saying this. But the question is, this interaction, where is it going? So it is treated more as haram of the means, especially in the kind of situation that I'm talking about, again looking at context. Therefore, when scholars want to relax certain rules, they would ask themselves, this thing that is haram, where you now want to grant some concession or permission, is it haram of the means? Is it prohibited because it could lead to the endangerment of the maqasid? Or is it haram of the ends? The thing itself is what is the danger to the maqasid. So that's one classification of haram.
Anna Ibrahim, what would you add to this?
Yeah, I think more to say on the haram of the ends. Haram of the means, really. Haram of the ends, as we say, they are the haram in themselves. They are the bottom. Now, haram of the means are those things that they are less harmful. The evil is not as much, but they are bad. They are prohibited because of what they will lead to. Indecent dressing, looking at somebody's private parts, or even touching private parts. They are haram, but not as haram. The prohibition is not as grievous a sin like that of zina itself. Selling alcohol, transporting it, supporting the chain of the business in a way is haram because you are aiding, but the gravity is not as that of the person that is drinking. Same thing, pork, selling pork, okay, or dealing in that. If you don't consume it, you're still doing haram, but the person that consumes it, his sin is more grievous. So all this chain is blocked, prohibited, because of what it is likely leading to. Pointing a weapon at somebody, prohibited. But why is it prohibited? Because of what it will lead to. It's not as dangerous as using the weapon on somebody. So generally, when it comes to relaxation, when somebody is in a difficult situation, these are the first set of prohibitions that are relaxed. They remain haram in a way. They are haram. But in fatwa, when somebody is in a difficult situation, scholars look at context, and these are the first sets they relax. Of course, they look at other situations surrounding you, and that's why the scholar really need to be conversant with the context. Are you in difficult situation that is life-threatening, or no? It will just make it easier for you to save your life. Sometimes you may have overlap. Some things are haram of the means, but they look like haram of the ends. Sometimes you don't have a very clear-cut definition. This intellectual effort is done by scholars so that you know what you can forfeit and what you cannot, what you can sacrifice and what you cannot. Basically, this, along with other tools of istidlal we discussed before, which we equally call safety net principles, maslaha, saddu zari'ah, istihsan, which are all logic-based tools that are concerned with consequence, come into play. So in situations like this, a scholar should decide what to do. But for somebody in a difficult situation, a scholar should do his best, at least to lessen his difficulty, particularly when we'll be looking at, okay, what are the categories of challenges and difficulties compared to the gravity of the sins we mentioned now, will determine which one needs to be relaxed or not. But as a rule, a scholar must do something for somebody that is in difficulty, looking at this and his context to see how you can lessen or at least help him.
I think if I may add, another thing that this categorization helps scholars do is when they line it up against, the person's condition. That thing I mentioned earlier, the standard of living or the status of life. If the person is in a state of darura, dire necessity, that is when the scholars are more likely to actually relax haram of the ends. Because of that maxim that says the darura, that is that necessity, should be measured according to its due proportion. So due proportion here would be, if you are looking at that deep level where it's a matter of life and death, then the response is likely, not in all cases, likely to also be strongly in favor of relaxing as much as possible, and that's where it tends to touch on haram of the ends.
So what you are basically saying is, when it comes to people's condition, the greater the severity of difficulty, the greater the suffering, the more the concessions.
Yes.
Yeah.
The less the hardship, the less the suffering, the lesser the concessions.
Yeah.
And on the side of the concessions, when it comes to the haram, these seem to be classified into two major categories, and as you've said, there's some overlap between them. One, which is more serious, is the haram of the ends. Those mafasid, those haram of the maqasid, those that directly affect the daruriyat, those harams that are major harams. And those that, so that's one category, what you call major harms, major harams, and the lesser ones that are the haram of the means. So by distinguishing between the two, scholars are able to have an approximation of saying, if you are in difficulty that is not too dire, too serious, but you do get a concession, your concession will only be with the minor harams or the haram of the means. Whereas when your situation gets more dire, more serious, then all the harams of the means, the minor ones and the major ones that are actually the things for which something is haram, would be relaxed. So from the point of view of the haram, you've mentioned what you call the minor ones and the major ones. When it comes to people's conditions, you've alluded to people's conditions that would warrant these difficulties are two main ones you've mentioned. They are darura situation and those that are in haja. Could you say more, Malam Ibrahim, on this categorization of people's conditions that warrant the concessions?
Yeah. Basically, scholars have in the past, and from usul point of view, used maslaha mursala, sadu zari'a, istihsan, basically, to see how they can ease the difficulty, or how they can enhance facility, as a golden rule in qawaid, that al-mashaqqa tajlibu at-taysir. But to be very objective and evidence-based in this, they come up with these classifications. So after classifying haram into haram of means and haram of ends, they group difficulties and challenges into levels based on their levels of necessity and how dire is the difficulty. So those situations that are life-threatening, situations in which or under which the survival of human race is under threat, are called daruriyat. Threat to life, no shelter, extreme poverty, your health, fear. All these situations, they call it daruriyat. These ones are called dire necessities. Darura means you are pressed, you are under duress. In fact, if nothing is done, you might die. This is a darura situation.
Or seriously suffer.
Very, very seriously suffer. Then you have haja, which is next to darura. Most likely you might not die, or the person might not die. but he will suffer. Life will be very difficult. Imagine where people live, where they don't have mobility today, and they have to trek 20, 30 kilometers. They need good roads, they need vehicles. Sometimes electricity too. Sometimes, functional education, or sometimes even basic education. Of course, basic education can be darura, but at least functional education, professionals in some key areas that can enhance the quality of their life. Okay? All of these are called hajiyat. Haja means needs, but really needs in the real sense of human. There's a difference between need and want. When you say somebody needs something, he really needs it. Then the third categorization is the tahsini. Tahsini usually is just perfection, embellishment, so finishing of a thing. They are important too because sometimes they provide means of survival for others. And just like we say, sometimes we don't find a very clear-cut demarcation between one and the next. There are some darura that are in one sense haja. There are some haja on the other hand that look like tahsini. So sort of this kind of overlap. So these are the three categorization of the needs.
You've explained these three situations.
Now,
You've made it clear that there are those essential needs for realizing those vital needs of life,
yeah,
the daruriyat.
yeah,
And when the daruriyat are threatened, an individual is described as being in a state of darura.
yeah,
The hajiyat are the next level of importance between the daruriyat and the tahsiniyat.
tahsiniyat, yeah,
When these are threatened,
yeah,
a person or community is said to be in a state of haja.
no.
Could you tell us more about darura? How do you describe a person in a state of darura, and what does a state of darura allow scholars to relax?
Okay. Now, darura, like I said earlier, is dire necessities. Your life is threatened, or at least your freedom is threatened. Usually, scholars will mention things like freedom of religion, the right to live, or freedom of, protection of life, protection of property, shelter, intellect, education. Now, in practical sense, let's look at it this way. If somebody couldn't pay his rent, he's no house of his own, and is thrown out of the apartment, absolutely he has no any other means. He's in darura situation. He's in darura situation. Because shelter is a basic need of human being. You could afford shelter, you can say because you don't have electricity is a secondary issue. But that you are out, really practically out, you are in darura situation. Or somebody has gotten a patient, his son, his mother, his wife, who needs emergency surgery. No. When you say surgery is emergency, you just need to do something now. Wherever a doctor or consultant or all the theater team are, they must be summoned immediately. That's called emergency. And then this person couldn't afford anything. He doesn't have money. And this is not a surgery you can book, you can delay, elective. This person is in darura situation. So these kind of situations are called darura. Somebody has starved 3 days running away from kidnappers or bandits or these kind of crimes here and there. He couldn't access any food nor drink in the last 3, 4, 5 days. And he just came across somebody's farm with ripe mango or at least some tubers of yam or cassava he can take. It's practically in the rural situation. People are running from armed robbers. They are running for their lives. And they stop somebody's vehicle. And they entered without negotiating. And they didn't even, this darura, the person shouldn't go negotiating that you have to pay. No. No. In situations like this, their life is threatened. So situations like this are darura situation. In reality, this is the peak of necessity, because they don't have a choice now. They are in emergency. So these kind of situations are called darura.
And as you've already mentioned in other times, the Quranic verse, فَمَنِ اضْطُرَّ غَيْرَ بَاغٍ وَلَا عَادٍ فَلَا إِثْمَ عَلَيْهِ. Whoever is driven into this type of situation, not desiring, not trying to, take advantage of it to do what is not necessary, la ithma alayhi, there is no sin on that person.
Yeah.
So a person in darura,
Yeah.
there is no sin on them if they commit what would normally be regarded as sins.
Yeah.
Whether it is haram of the means or haram of the ends, these get relaxed for people who are in darura.
Yeah.
Let us look at you wanted to add?
Yeah. The thing with darura is, all rules are relaxed. All rules are relaxed. And like you mentioned the verse earlier, فَمَنِ اضْطُرَّ غَيْرَ بَاغٍ وَلَا عَادٍ فَلَا إِثْمَ عَلَيْهِ. And that is why a scholar will mention Sheikh Nasir Sa'di. He said, وَلَيْسَ وَاجِبٌ بِلَا اقْتِدَارٍ وَلَا مُحَرَّمٍ مَا اضْطِرَارٍ. You can't make something binding, wajib, when somebody cannot do it. You have to be able to. And there is no haram in the face of darura. So when you have droughts, when you have famine, when you have difficult situations, all of these are called darura. And in this situation, Islam will actually relax, whatever is the case. For now, sometimes even wajib will become permissible.
No more wajib. Yeah.
Muslims that are minorities and threatened in the state of fear, or real threat to her life when she declares she's a Muslim, she's in darura situation. So a number of things will be relaxed and permissible here. Yes.
I would also add that principle that darura is proportionate to its severity, even where a person is in one form of darura. A greater haram would not, for example, be permissible. So yes, you are starving and you need food. It doesn't justify killing somebody to get their food.
Yeah.
Or getting food for 2 months.
Or getting food for 2 months because you are in darura. So that, yes, certain things that are normally haram will become halal, but also proportionate. That the haram should not be greater or cause a greater darura than the one you are in for others.
Proportionate to the need.
Proportionate to the need.
I said biqadriha.
Exactly. Tuqaddiru biqadriha. Sister Salah, we've discussed darura, a person who is in dire need, life is threatened, and concessions of all the major categories are made, of course, proportionate to the person's situation. What would you say about a situation where a person is not in that dire situation, but is next to that? A person is in a state of haja. What do we mean by a person is in a state of haja, and what does a state of haja allow the scholars to permit that would normally be prohibited?
Okay. I think Brother Ibrahim has already touched on what haja constitutes. So in a simple sentence, it's anything that supports the individual or the community from staying away from a situation of darura. So it's supporting that sustainability of life conditions and all those, the universal maqasid. Now, when a person is in a state of haja, we know this is not a matter of dire necessity. They can still survive. Just life will be difficult. Life would actually bring them closer to suffering. And the goal of Sharia is to ensure that people do not exist or continuously stay in a state of darura. So once there's that threat to haja, it's taken that therefore there's threat of people falling into a state of dire necessity. For that reason, therefore, the concessions that are given, the area of the kind of haram that the scholars would first consider would be haram of the means, because that is what is considered proportional to that. Haram of the means. I used the example earlier of flirting. And even the whole idea of a man and a woman shouldn't stay alone together in a room behind a closed door. If they do, the third person is shaitan. Of course, you could say, but we are not going to do anything. That's why that is haram of the means. It's what does that make possible? What does that make, what does it facilitate? Now, when we look at a situation where someone has to go see a doctor, and we'll say, okay, this is darura. Therefore, the person, if it's a female doctor and a male patient, for instance, they go into an examination room, they can shut the door. But that being alone in a room, which is the haram of the means, is now permissible because there's something at stake that needs to be dealt with. And once they've left the haja position, and why one may even say it could also be haja, is this person who is coming for this examination may not actually have an identified illness yet. It's just, I feel something here, I feel something there, let me go to the hospital and see. In some cases, it's just a routine checkup. You are fine, but you want to make sure you do not fall into that state of dire necessity. One more thing to mention, because of this, how these things overlap. If a community is in a state of haja, it is treated as though they are already in darura. So in as much as it is still called a state of haja, the response would be as though this community is already in a state of darura, just the way you would handle, or the mujtahid would handle an individual in a state of darura, state of dire necessity. That takes us back to that issue when we talked about scope of harm or benefits, the condition, who is being affected. So it's seen that when you have a high number of people in a state of haja, if it's allowed to persist, more and more people fall into a state of darura, which just magnifies the problem, compounds the problem. These are some of the other points that go with the classification of haram when people are in a context where it's a haja situation.
I think for many people, this is new. For most people, they know when you are in darura. In fact, growing up, everybody tells you, oh, if you are starving, you can eat pork and you can eat carrion. If your life is threatened, this is permissible, etc. What I think is new for many is the concessions due to a state of haja, where your situation is not as bad as darura, but it's definitely not tahsin. It's not situation where you're in, comfortable, no problem. You do have a problem.
There's a real need.
There is a need. It's not just severe enough to relax all laws. And what you're saying here is, for people in haja, there are rules that govern the kind of laws that are relaxed for them. And in a subsequent, in another episode, we will look at more examples of each of these. But just so that we introduce the subject, and you've already, I think, put the key things on the table, that a person in a state of haja, the kind of concessions they get would be permitting them certain haram of the means, those minor harams, but not haram of the ends. You have to be in a state of darura before haram of the ends become permissible. But haram of the means, as you've given example, seeing the aura, touching a person's private part for a medical purpose, these are haram usually because they would lead to the haram of the ends. But since this person is in a haja situation, then it's permissible, even if it is just a routine checkup or that. So one, you've made it clear, a person in a state of haja, the minor harams and those haram of the means are temporarily permissible while their situation lasts, whereas haram of the ends, the major ones, stay prohibited. You've also said that when a person is in a state of, or when a community is in a state of haja, it is treated as being similar to darura. When it's, in other words, haja to a community is much more serious than haja to just one individual. The moment it starts affecting the community, it is heading the community in the area of crisis, of darura. Haja to the community is treated like a darura. One may also add that when a person is in a state of haja, the differences of opinion among scholars is used as a rukhsa. In other words, concession is given as a source of rahmah to people who are in haja. When it comes to outside haja now, so we've talked about darura, we've talked about haja. When we now talk about tahsiniyat, those luxuries, and when they may be threatened, or a person who is enjoying them is still in a state of tahsini, what are the Sharia rulings around tahsiniyat and people in that condition? Any concessions?
Yeah, tahsiniyat as a rule doesn't allow any concessions. But they are important too, in that, yeah, they constitute means of living for a number of people, and they also show how well off one is, an ability to help others. Okay? But they don't give any concession. You cannot go for bank loan to paint. You cannot go for haram or a loan with usury, with interest to paint your house. It's luxury. You can't steal, or you can't go for money, loan or do haram because you want to buy a particular quality or material of clothing. Things like sport and entertainment, your pets, designing our houses, decorations, flowers, horticulture, or some of these things.
Jewelry.
They are all tahsini, even though they might be haja for somebody. But for you, the end user, they are tahsini, and they don't fall in category of those things that for whatever reason, Sharia will ever lift or give you rukhsa, yani license to commit haram or make haram halal in a way. Yes.
So you've made it clear that people who are in a state of luxury, they are not going through any difficulties, and they are in a state where Sharia considers the ideal, the default for all its rulings. So when it says pork is haram, it's assumed you are not in haja or darura.
Yeah.
When it says riba is haram, when it says, all of these rulings, they are making things haram for people in tahsini. So when you are in that situation where you are comfortable, you are not in any need, there are no concessions available. Even though jewelry, as you've said, may be tahsini for the end user, when it is the person who is in the trenches digging for the gold, the poor man who is busy looking for gold in the riverbed, his situation may be different because he is dealing with a haja, or his job may even be his darura. But the judgment of the scholar is looking at you and your own situation. And for jewelry, or the use of jewelry, for example, entertainment, you've brought a number of other examples, these do not allow any concessions. What we have looked at, and today you've distinguished haram into two categories generally, but you've said there can be overlap and therefore a difference among scholars regarding whether this is haram of the means or haram of the ends, which is whether this is a major haram or there's a minor haram. So yes, you will have some differences there, but there are those things they will agree, this is major and this is minor. This is haram in and of itself, what some will describe as haram bidhatihi, haram of the mafsada itself, the haram associated with the maqasid, and those that are haram lighayrihi. This is haram because of something else, because of what it will lead to, what we describe as the haram of the means. Then you have also classified the conditions of people, where when your condition changes, the fatwas around you change. And when you are in tahsini situation and you are comfortable, no fatwas change for you. When you find yourself into a state of haja, haram of the means may be relaxed, but not haram of the ends. When your situation gets worse and you fall into darura, haram of the means and the ends, the minor and the major, become permissible, of course, proportionately. Insha'Allah, what we will do on another occasion is go more slowly through these categories with more examples, especially from the time of the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba. For now, I'd like to thank you for this introduction to the ways of classifying the harams and the ways of classifying the conditions, so that when we look into how change in situation affects change in fatwa, we know the relationship between the fatwa being given or the application of maslaha or saddu zariya to the changed condition and the quality of suffering or hardship a person may be going through. Jazakumullahu khairan. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuhu.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.